Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, pull up a chair because you're about to step into one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Drop in the comments right now. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? And have you ever heard the Sodder Children story before? Let's make this feel like we're all gathered around a crackling fire, sharing secrets that refuse to stay buried. If you're a subscriber, thank you. You keep stories like this alive. Hit that like button if you love deep dives into true historical enigmas, and let's begin. Picture it, Christmas Eve, 1945, in the rolling hills of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The air is crisp with the scent of pine and coal smoke drifting from the chimneys of the small Appalachian town nestled near what would one day become New River Gorge National Park. For George and Jennie Sodder, it was supposed to be a night of simple joy after years of hard work and the shadow of World War. George, born Giorgio Sodder in the rugged hills of Tula, Sardinia, had arrived in America at 13, alone and determined. He built a thriving trucking business hauling coal and freight, turning himself into a respected middle-class provider in a community full of Italian immigrants who had come seeking the same dream. Jennie, whose own family had emigrated from Italy when she was a toddler, ran the household with quiet strength, raising their 10 children in a sturdy 2-story timber frame home 2 miles north of town. The Sodders were the kind of family that embodied the promise of post-war America: loud, loving, hard-working. The older kids helped with the trucks or chores, the younger ones filled the house with laughter. That December, the nation was breathing easier after the war's end. Soldiers were coming home, including the Sodders' eldest son Joseph, though he was still away in the army that night. The younger children, Maurice, 14, already showing his father's stubborn spark. Martha, 12, with her bright eyes and quick smile, Louis, 9 or 10 depending on the record, full of boyish energy, Jennie Irene, 8, named after her mother and just as spirited, and little Betty, 5, the baby of the upstairs crew, had begged to stay up late. They wanted to play with their new toys by the tree, the kind of simple gifts that meant everything in those days: a doll, a truck, maybe a board game. The house smelled of roasted chestnuts and the faint sweetness of Italian pastries Jennie had baked, blending old country traditions with the down-home Appalachian Christmas carols playing softly on the radio. But beneath the holiday warmth, tension simmered in the Italian community of Fayetteville. George was no stranger to speaking his mind. He had left Italy partly to escape the rising shadow of Benito Mussolini's regime, and he made no secret of his contempt for the dictator. In heated conversations at the local store or over coffee, he'd argue fiercely against fascism, alienating some neighbors who still held quiet sympathies. Months earlier, a life insurance salesman had stormed out after George turned down a policy, snarling a chilling warning: "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." George brushed it off as bluster. After all, who would harm a hard-working family over politics? Yet that night, as the clock ticked past midnight, the first strange note pierced the peace. Around 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang downstairs. Jennie, startled from sleep, patted down in the dark to answer. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and edged with a strange, unsettling laugh, asked for someone who didn't live there. "Wrong number," Jennie said politely, hanging up. She noticed the lights still on downstairs and the curtains undrawn. Marion, the 17-year-old, had dozed off on the living room couch after the younger ones finally went up to bed. Shaking her head, Jennie turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and climbed back upstairs. The house settled again into quiet. Then came the thud. Around 1 o'clock, Jennie jolted awake to a heavy crash on the roof, like something solid had landed and rolled off into the night. She lay there listening, heart pounding, but the sound didn't repeat. She drifted off once more, until the unmistakable bite of smoke filled her nostrils. Panic surged. Flames were already licking through George's downstairs office near the fuse box and telephone. She shook her husband awake. "George!" Fire. Together they grabbed 2-year-old Sylvia from her crib in their room and rushed the older children, John, 23, Marion, 16-year-old George Jr., out into the freezing December air. Shouts echoed up the staircase toward the 2 upstairs bedrooms where the 5 younger ones slept, separated by the now blazing hallway. "Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, get out!" No answer came. The stairs were a roaring inferno. George, desperate, tried to re-enter through a window, slicing his arm on broken glass, but the smoke blinded him. He raced to the barn for the ladder they always kept there, only to find it missing. The family truck, which might have reached the windows, wouldn't start. Its battery had somehow gone dead. A water barrel outside was frozen solid. Marion sprinted to a neighbor's to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, just 2.5 miles away. The line wouldn't connect. Another motorist tried from a nearby tavern, still no response. In the end, the chief himself was roused, but he admitted the crew was short-staffed on Christmas, and he couldn't even drive the truck himself. Hours would pass before help arrived. The Sodders stood helpless in the snow, watching flames devour their home in a furious 30 to 40-minute blaze. The children's faces haunted every shadow. Those dark-haired, solemn-eyed kids who had gone to bed excited about Christmas morning. George and Jennie screamed their names until their voices cracked, but only the crackle of fire answered. By dawn, the house was a smoldering skeleton of ash and twisted metal. The family clung to each other, shivering not just from cold, but from a growing, unspeakable dread. Where were the 5? Surely they had to be inside, didn't they? Yet as the sun rose over the mountains on Christmas Day, 1945, the real nightmare was only beginning. No bones, no bodies, just questions that would burn hotter than the fire itself. As the pale winter sun climbed over the snow-dusted mountains of Fayetteville on Christmas morning 1945, the Sodder family stood amid the ruins of what had once been their home. The air hung heavy with the acrid stench of charred wood and melted rubber, a bitter contrast to the festive scents of the night before. George and Jennie, their faces streaked with soot and frozen tears, clutched little Sylvia close while their older children, John, Mary, and George Jr., stared in stunned silence at the skeletal remains of the 2-story timber house. The fire had raged with unnatural speed, consuming everything in a furious blaze that firefighters later described as one of the hottest they had ever seen in the area. Yet something felt profoundly wrong even in those first disoriented hours. The volunteer fire department, delayed by holiday staffing shortages and communication failures, finally arrived well after the house had collapsed into a pile of ash and twisted debris. Chief F.J. Maurice and his men began a cursory search through the smoldering wreckage, sifting through the rubble where the upstairs bedrooms had been. They expected to find bones, perhaps small, fragile ones from the 5 missing children. 14-year-old Maurice with his father's determined jaw, 12-year-old Martha whose laughter had filled the house, 9-year-old Louis full of mischief, 8-year-old Jennie Irene who mirrored her mother's gentle spirit, and 5-year-old Betty, the baby who still clutched her favorite doll at bedtime. But the search yielded nothing. No skulls, no teeth, no recognizable fragments of bone or clothing, not even the metal bed springs or household items that should have survived in some form. The official verdict came swiftly. The fire had burned so intensely that the children's bodies had been completely cremated, reduced to ash scattered by the wind across the Appalachian hills. The coroner convened a quick inquest and declared the 5 dead on December 30th, closing the case as an accidental electrical fire sparked by faulty wiring near George's downstairs office. For most families, that might have been the end, an unspeakable tragedy to be mourned and buried. But for George and Jennie Sodder, immigrants who had built their lives through sheer grit and old-world resilience, the absence of any physical trace ignited a fire of doubt that would never extinguish. In the tight-knit Italian-American community of Fayetteville, where coal trucks rumbled along mountain roads and Sunday dinners blended pasta with Appalachian cornbread, whispers began almost immediately. Why had the telephone line gone dead right when Marion tried to call for help? Later investigation would reveal it had been deliberately cut. Why was the ladder, always propped against the side of the house for chores and repairs, nowhere to be found that night, only to turn up days later at the bottom of a 75-foot embankment, as if someone had intentionally moved it out of reach? The family's 2 coal trucks, which George planned to drive against the house to reach the upstairs windows, refused to start despite being in good condition. Their batteries had somehow failed at the worst possible moment. These were not mere coincidences in the eyes of a grieving father. George, the Sardinian-born man who had crossed the ocean alone as a boy and built a successful trucking business through hard work and blunt honesty, began piecing together the strange events leading up to that night. The wrong number phone call around 12:30 a.m. A woman's voice with an odd, unsettling laugh asking for someone who didn't live there. The heavy thud on the roof that Jennie had heard shortly after was like an object being thrown or dropped. The life insurance salesman's furious threat months earlier, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed," delivered after George refused a policy and continued voicing his fierce opposition to Benito Mussolini. In the Italian immigrant circles of West Virginia, where some still harbored quiet sympathies for the fascist regime back home, George's outspoken criticism had created enemies. Heated arguments at the general store or over coffee were not uncommon, and the shadow of old country politics lingered even in this new land of opportunity. As days turned into weeks, the Sodders' pain hardened into determination. They refused to accept the easy explanation of a total cremation. Experts they consulted later pointed out that even in intense house fires, bones and teeth usually survive in some form, especially in a wooden structure that burned for less than an hour. Human bodies do not simply vanish without a trace, no matter how hot the flames. In 1949, George persuaded a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar Hunter to supervise a more thorough excavation of the site. They dug through layers of dirt and ash, unearthing small artifacts, a child's dictionary, some coins, a few buttons. But the only bone fragments found were a handful of lumbar vertebrae, later analyzed at the Smithsonian Institution. The expert concluded they belonged to someone between 16 and 22 years old, far older than any of the missing Sodder children, and showed no signs of having been exposed to fire. Rumors even circulated that the fragments may have been planted from a nearby cemetery, though nothing was ever proven. These discoveries only deepened the family's conviction that their 5 children had not perished in the flames. Perhaps the fire had been set as a diversion, a cruel, calculated arson to cover up something far more sinister, a kidnapping. The children might have been lured or forced from the house before the blaze fully took hold, spirited away into the night while their parents fought desperately to reach them. In the isolated hills of 1940s West Virginia, with its network of back roads and coal camps, such a thing was not impossible. And the motive? Revenge against George for his anti-Mussolini stance, possibly carried out by someone with ties to the Sicilian Mafia or local sympathizers who saw the outspoken immigrant as a threat. George had never spoken much about his reasons for leaving Sardinia in 1908, fueling quiet speculation that old feuds from the old country had followed him across the Atlantic. The grief was visceral, a constant ache that colored every holiday, every quiet moment. Jennie, who had baked those chestnut pastries with such care, now wandered the ruins at night, calling softly into the darkness for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. George threw himself into a private investigation, hiring detectives and chasing every lead, no matter how faint. The mountains that had once represented freedom and prosperity now felt like a vast, indifferent witness to their loss. Yet amid the sorrow, a fierce hope took root. The belief that somewhere their children might still be alive, perhaps raised under different names in another town, carrying fragments of their Italian Appalachian heritage without knowing their true story. The official ruling stood unchallenged by authorities, but the Sodders would not let the matter rest. They began to question everything: the delayed fire response, the quick closure of the case, the lack of any real forensic effort. In small-town America just after the war, resources were stretched thin, and uncomfortable questions about immigrant feuds or possible corruption were easier to avoid. But for one family, avoidance was never an option. Their search was only beginning, a lifelong odyssey that would take them far beyond the hills of Fayetteville and keep their children's faces alive in the public eye for decades. The mountains held their secrets close, but George and Jennie were determined to tear those secrets into the light, no matter the cost. Years turned into decades, yet for George and Jennie Sodder, the fire of Christmas Eve 1945 never truly went out. It burned quietly in their chests, a relentless flame fueled by love, grief, and an unyielding refusal to accept that their 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Irene, and little Betty, had simply vanished into ash on that frigid Appalachian night. In the small Italian-American community of Fayetteville, where coal dust still clung to the roads, and Sunday masses blended Latin prayers with the lilt of mountain accents, the Sodders became known not just for their tragedy, but for their stubborn hope. George, the once vibrant Sardinian immigrant who had built a thriving trucking business through sheer will, channeled his pain into action. He hired private detectives, wrote letters to congressmen, and personally scoured leads across West Virginia and beyond. Jennie, whose gentle hands had once prepared holiday feasts blending old country recipes with local traditions, now kept a quiet vigil, her dark eyes forever searching the horizon of the rolling hills. Their private investigation uncovered layer after layer of unsettling details that official reports had conveniently overlooked. Witnesses came forward years later claiming they had seen a man loitering near the Sodder property on Christmas Eve, behaving strangely. Others recalled a suspicious car with out-of-state plates parked along the road that night. The cut telephone line, the missing ladder, the inexplicably dead truck batteries, all pointed to deliberate sabotage rather than random misfortune. Some detectives even explored connections to the Sicilian Mafia, suggesting that George's vocal opposition to Mussolini had made powerful enemies who viewed the outspoken immigrant as a dangerous example in the tight-knit Italian communities scattered through the coalfields. In the post-war years, when Old World loyalty still simmered beneath the surface of American assimilation, such a motive was not as far-fetched as it might sound today. Rumors of threats and warnings that George had dismissed as bluster now took on ominous weight. As the 1950s unfolded, reported sightings of the missing children began to trickle in from across the country, each one a dagger of hope that pierced the family's guarded hearts. A woman in Florida claimed she had seen 5 dark-haired siblings who bore a striking resemblance to the Sodder kids, speaking with a faint mountain drawl mixed with Italian inflection. Another tip placed them in a traveling circus or an orphanage somewhere in the Midwest. The most persistent story involved a photograph mailed anonymously to the family years later, showing a group of young adults that looked eerily like grown-up versions of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. The young man in the image had the same strong jaw as George. The girls shared Jennie's soft features and expressive eyes. On the back of the photo was a cryptic postmark and a single handwritten note, Louis Sodder. The family pored over it for hours, tears mixing with desperate analysis, but they could never prove its authenticity. Still, it was enough to keep their search alive. In a bold and heartbreaking act of defiance against official silence, the Sodders erected a large billboard along busy Route 16 near their new home in Fayetteville. It featured enlarged photos of the 5 missing children with the bold headline, "Missing," and offered a substantial reward for any information leading to their recovery. For decades, that billboard stood as a silent sentinel along the mountain highway, weathered by rain and snow but never taken down. Travelers passing through the New River Gorge area would slow their cars, stare at the faded images of those solemn-eyed children frozen in time, and wonder at the story behind it. Locals grew used to it as part of the landscape, a haunting reminder that some mysteries refuse to fade. George and Jennie maintained it with fierce dedication, updating contact information and sometimes adding new details from their ongoing investigation. It became their way of keeping Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Irene, and Betty's faces before the public eye, refusing to let the world forget that 5 young lives had disappeared without a trace. The emotional toll was immense. Holidays, especially Christmas, became days of quiet agony rather than joy. The family would gather with the surviving children and grandchildren, but an empty space lingered at every table. The absence of 5 voices that should have grown into adulthood, perhaps marrying, raising families of their own, and carrying forward the Sodder name with its blend of Sardinian fire and Appalachian resilience. George, whose once powerful frame began to stoop with age and sorrow, spent his final years driving the same mountain roads he had once hauled coal over, stopping at diners and gas stations to show photos and ask if anyone had seen his children. Jennie, ever the quiet strength of the family, maintained a small shrine in their new home with the children's pictures, a few cherished toys that had survived the fire, and candles that burned late into the night. Their faith, rooted in the Catholic traditions they had brought from Italy, offered some comfort, but it could not erase the raw wound of uncertainty. George Sodder passed away in 1969 at the age of 74, still convinced that his 5 children had been taken rather than lost to the flames. Jennie followed in 1989, dying at 89 without ever receiving the closure she had prayed for through more than 4 decades of searching. Both went to their graves with the same unanswered questions burning in their hearts. What really happened that Christmas Eve? Were their children alive somewhere, living under different names, perhaps never knowing their true origins? Or had something far darker occurred in the shadows of those West Virginia mountains? The couple left behind a legacy of love and perseverance that inspired countless others to question easy answers and demand truth, even when authorities preferred silence. Today, the Sodder Children case remains one of America's most enduring mysteries, a story that continues to captivate because it touches something deeply human: the unbreakable bond between parents and children, the immigrant dream shadowed by old-world grudges, and the quiet terror that justice can slip away in the cracks of small-town bureaucracy. Modern investigators and amateur sleuths still pore over the files, debating theories ranging from Mafia retaliation to a botched kidnapping gone wrong, or even wilder ideas involving human trafficking networks active in the post-war years. DNA technology and advanced forensic methods that didn't exist in 1945 could potentially solve it if new evidence ever surfaces. But for now, the mountains of West Virginia still guard their secrets. The billboard is long gone, taken down after Jennie's death, but its image endures in books, documentaries, and online discussions. In Fayetteville, the site of the original home has become a place where curious visitors sometimes stop, imagining the laughter of children that once filled the air before it was silenced by fire and shadow. George and Jennie's surviving family members have carried the story forward, honoring the parents who never stopped searching. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of 5 young souls, or the adults they might have become, still wander those misty Appalachian ridges, waiting for the truth to finally come home. The Sodder mystery reminds us that some fires never die. They smolder in the human heart, lighting the way for those brave enough to keep looking even when the trail grows cold and the mountains offer only silence.